The gunfight that should have lasted 30 seconds stretched on for 20 minutes, with dozens of men pulling triggers on weapons that refused to fire. As federal marshals and slave catchers stood helplessly clicking empty guns, the escaped slaves they were hunting disappeared into the night. It wasn't until later that investigators realized every weapon in that failed battle had been crafted by the same man, Klaus Mueller, the gunsmith whose guns never worked. The dusty street outside Redemption, Texas, had been chosen specifically for the confrontation that would determine the fate of 47 escaped slaves who had been traced to a nearby safe house. On one side stood Marshal David Kane and his federal agents, armed with the finest weapons that government money could buy. On the other side were the notorious Hartwell brothers and their gang of professional slave catchers, carrying rifles and pistols that had never failed them in 2 decades of violent manhunts. Between them, hiding in the basement of Dr. Sarah Coleman's medical clinic, were men, women, and children who had risked everything for the chance to taste freedom. The confrontation had been building for weeks as both federal authorities and private bounty hunters closed in on what they believed would be the largest capture of fugitive slaves in Texas history. But when Marshal Kane gave the signal to advance and the Hartwell brothers raised their weapons, something unprecedented happened in the annals of American frontier violence. Not a single shot was fired. Klaus Mueller's gun shop had been the most successful firearms business in East Texas for over 20 years, serving customers from across 3 territories who came seeking the finest crafted weapons available on the frontier. His shop on Commerce Street in Tyler was always bustling with activity, as ranchers, lawmen, hunters, and soldiers examined his latest creations and placed orders for custom firearms that would serve them in the dangerous work of frontier life. At 61 years old, Klaus was a master craftsman whose reputation had been built on his extraordinary attention to detail and his ability to create weapons that were both functional and beautiful. Born in Bavaria, he had learned his trade from his father, who had been gunsmith to German nobility before the family emigrated to America in search of new opportunities. Klaus combined old-world precision with new-world innovation, creating firearms that were marvels of mechanical engineering. His rifles were renowned for their accuracy at distances that seemed impossible to achieve with frontier weapons. His pistols were balanced perfectly for quick-draw situations that could mean the difference between life and death in a lawless territory. His shotguns delivered devastating firepower that could stop charging animals or desperate men with equal effectiveness. Customers would travel hundreds of miles to acquire Klaus Mueller weapons, knowing that their lives might depend on the reliability of his craftsmanship. But there was something deeply unusual about Klaus's customer base that became apparent only to those who observed his business over extended periods. While his weapons were purchased by people from all walks of frontier life, they seemed to fail with suspicious frequency when used by certain types of customers. Slave catchers would report that their Klaus Mueller rifles misfired during crucial moments of pursuit. Federal marshals found that their custom pistols jammed when they attempted to arrest Underground Railroad operatives. Most puzzling of all, these failures seemed to occur only when the weapons were being used against people who were fighting for their freedom. Dr. Sarah Coleman had been one of Klaus's most loyal customers for over 15 years, regularly purchasing rifles and pistols despite the fact that she rarely engaged in activities that required firearms. When questioned about her extensive collection of Klaus Mueller weapons, Dr. Coleman would explain that she appreciated fine craftsmanship and that she felt safer having reliable firearms available for protection in her remote medical practice. Similarly, James Morrison, who operated a large freight business that transported goods throughout East Texas, had purchased dozens of weapons from Klaus over the years. Morrison claimed that he needed reliable firearms to protect his wagons from bandits and hostile Indians. But observant townspeople noticed that Morrison's drivers rarely carried their weapons openly and seemed more concerned with concealing them than with displaying them as deterrents to potential thieves. What the people of Tyler didn't understand was that Klaus Mueller wasn't just a gunsmith. He was one of the most effective saboteurs in the history of the Underground Railroad. His weapons were carefully engineered to function perfectly for legitimate customers while failing catastrophically when used by slave catchers, federal agents, and other enforcers of the slavery system. Klaus's true background was far more complex than the simple immigrant craftsman story that he presented to his community. He was Klaus Wilhelm Müller von Steinberg, a former captain in the Prussian army who had been court-martialed and exiled for refusing to fire on civilian protesters during the democratic uprisings of 1848. His military training had included extensive study of firearms technology and military engineering, making him uniquely qualified to create weapons that could be selectively disabled through ingenious mechanical modifications. The techniques that Klaus used to sabotage weapons intended for slave catchers were masterpieces of mechanical engineering that were virtually undetectable to users who didn't understand the principles involved. His rifles contained hidden mechanisms that would cause misfires when specific environmental conditions were present, conditions that could be controlled by Underground Railroad operatives who understood how to trigger the failures. A Klaus Mueller rifle might function perfectly during target practice or hunting activities, but would fail to fire when used in areas where certain chemical compounds had been applied to vegetation or structures. These compounds were undetectable to human senses, but would react with hidden elements in the rifle's firing mechanism, causing temporary malfunctions that would clear themselves after the weapon was removed from the contaminated environment. Klaus's pistols contained even more sophisticated sabotage mechanisms that could be triggered by Underground Railroad operatives who understood the secret techniques involved. A slight pressure applied to a hidden spring during loading would cause the weapon to misfire on its next use. A specific sequence of manipulations performed while cleaning the weapon would render it inoperable for exactly 24 hours before normal function resumed. Most ingeniously, Klaus had developed techniques for creating weapons that would function normally for their purchasers, but would fail when used by anyone else. These weapons contained mechanisms that responded to specific physical characteristics, hand size, grip pressure, trigger technique, that would be unique to the original customer. Slave catchers who captured or stole these weapons would find them completely useless, while Underground Railroad operatives who understood the activation requirements could use them effectively. The network that supported Klaus's sabotage operation was extensive and sophisticated, involving dozens of people throughout East Texas who helped coordinate the distribution of sabotaged weapons and the intelligence needed to ensure they failed at crucial moments. Dr. Coleman's medical practice served as a communication center where information about upcoming slave-catching operations was gathered and disseminated to Underground Railroad networks. Morrison's freight business provided the transportation network needed to distribute Klaus's sabotaged weapons to slave catchers and federal agents throughout the territory. Morrison's drivers were actually Underground Railroad operatives who could identify the customers most likely to use weapons against escaped slaves and ensure that those customers receive the most comprehensively sabotaged firearms. The chemical compounds needed to trigger environmental failures in Klaus's rifles were manufactured by sympathetic apothecaries and distributed through a network of general stores and trading posts that served areas where slave-catching activities were common. Underground Railroad operatives could prepare ambush sites or safe house areas by applying these compounds to vegetation and structures, creating zones where Klaus's sabotaged weapons would be completely unreliable. The intelligence network that informed Klaus's sabotage activities was remarkable in its scope and accuracy. The Underground Railroad had developed sources within federal law enforcement agencies, private slave-catching organizations, and plantation management systems that provided advance warning about planned manhunts and enforcement operations. This intelligence allowed Klaus to ensure that the most dangerous slave catchers and federal agents received the most comprehensively sabotaged weapons. Klaus's operation had been extraordinarily successful for over 20 years, preventing countless captures and probably saving thousands of lives through strategic weapon failures. But the confrontation in Redemption represented the largest test his sabotage network had ever faced, involving multiple federal agencies and the most experienced slave catchers in the territory. The build-up to the Redemption confrontation had begun 3 months earlier when federal authorities received intelligence about a massive underground railroad operation that was moving escaped slaves from plantations throughout the Deep South to freedom in Mexico and Canada. The operation involved hundreds of people and represented the largest coordinated escape attempt in the history of American slavery. Marshal Kane had been assigned to coordinate the federal response, working with local law enforcement agencies and private slave-catching organizations to intercept the escaped slaves before they could reach Mexican territory, where American law enforcement had no jurisdiction. The intelligence indicated that the fugitives would be consolidated at a safe house in Redemption before making their final dash to the border. The Hartwell brothers had been recruited to lead the private slave-catching effort because of their reputation for ruthless efficiency and their extensive experience in tracking and capturing escaped slaves. Their organization included dozens of professional manhunters who were equipped with the finest weapons available and who had never failed to capture their targets. But what neither Kane nor the Hartwell brothers realized was that virtually every weapon they would carry into the Redemption confrontation had been crafted by Klaus Mueller and had been specifically designed to fail at the crucial moment when they would attempt to fire on escaped slaves and their protectors. The intelligence network that had informed federal authorities about the Redemption operation had been carefully manipulated by Underground Railroad coordinators who wanted to lure as many slave catchers and federal agents as possible into a single location where Klaus's sabotaged weapons could neutralize them simultaneously. The operation was designed not just to help 47 specific individuals escape to freedom, but to demonstrate the complete unreliability of the weapons that slave-catching organizations depended on. Dr. Coleman had spent weeks preparing the Redemption area by applying Klaus's chemical compounds to buildings, vegetation, and equipment throughout the town. These compounds would trigger environmental failures in any Klaus Mueller rifles that were brought into the area, ensuring that the most powerful weapons carried by federal agents would be completely useless during the confrontation. Morrison's freight network had ensured that replacement weapons and ammunition acquired by federal and private agents in the weeks before the confrontation would also be sabotaged. Even weapons that weren't manufactured by Klaus had been compromised through substituted ammunition, modified firing pins, and other forms of sabotage that would cause failures at crucial moments. Most importantly, Underground Railroad operatives had infiltrated the support networks of both federal agencies and private slave-catching organizations, providing them with intelligence about weapon preferences and purchasing patterns that allowed Klaus's network to ensure that the most dangerous individuals received the most comprehensively sabotaged firearms. The confrontation itself unfolded exactly as Klaus and his collaborators had planned. When Marshal Kane and the Hartwell brothers attempted to storm Dr. Coleman's clinic, their weapons failed simultaneously and spectacularly. Rifles that had never misfired during years of service suddenly refused to fire. Pistols that had been meticulously maintained jammed repeatedly. Shotguns that should have delivered devastating firepower produced nothing but empty clicks. For 20 minutes, dozens of armed men stood in the streets of Redemption, pulling triggers on weapons that had been rendered completely useless by Klaus Mueller's sabotage network. During those 20 minutes, the 47 escaped slaves who had been hiding in Dr. Coleman's clinic were evacuated through Underground Railroad routes that led to safety in Mexico. But the Redemption confrontation represented more than just a successful rescue operation. It demonstrated to federal authorities and slave-catching organizations that their weapons could no longer be trusted in operations against escaped slaves. The psychological impact of the mass weapon failure was devastating to the morale of professional manhunters who had built their careers on superior firepower and military-style tactics. News of the redemption incident spread quickly throughout law enforcement and slave-catching communities, creating widespread paranoia about weapon reliability and sabotage activities. Slave catchers began to suspect that their firearms had been compromised, leading to extensive and expensive efforts to replace weapons and verify the integrity of their equipment. Federal authorities launched investigations into the weapon failures, but Klaus's sabotage techniques were too sophisticated and too well concealed to be detected by conventional analysis. The investigators concluded that the failures had been caused by defective ammunition or environmental factors, never suspecting that the weapons themselves had been deliberately engineered to fail. The success of the redemption operation inspired underground railroad networks throughout the South to adopt similar sabotage tactics. Klaus's techniques were shared with sympathetic gunsmiths and mechanics in other territories, creating a widespread network of weapon saboteurs who could neutralize the firepower advantages that had previously made slave-catching operations so successful. Over the following months, reports of weapon failures during slave-catching operations became increasingly common throughout the South and Southwest. Rifles would misfire during crucial pursuit situations. Pistols would jam when federal agents attempted to make arrests. The reliability that law enforcement and private manhunters had taken for granted was systematically undermined by sabotage activities that they couldn't detect or prevent. The psychological impact of these weapon failures extended beyond their immediate tactical effects. Slave catchers and federal agents began to lose confidence in their equipment and their ability to successfully complete their missions. Many experienced manhunters left the profession entirely, unwilling to risk their lives with weapons they couldn't trust. The economic impact was equally significant. Slave-catching organizations were forced to invest heavily in new weapons and equipment, often replacing perfectly functional firearms because of suspicions about sabotage. The cost of maintaining reliable arsenals became prohibitive for many private operators, forcing them out of business or significantly reducing their operational capacity. Klaus's sabotage network had effectively ended the era of large-scale, military-style, slave-catching operations that had terrorized escaped slaves and underground railroad operatives for decades. The weapons that had once given manhunters overwhelming advantages over their targets could no longer be trusted, leveling the playing field and making escape operations far more likely to succeed. The investigation that eventually exposed Klaus's activities began when federal authorities noticed patterns in weapon failures that suggested systematic sabotage rather than random mechanical problems. Agent Thomas Bradford, who specialized in investigating industrial sabotage, was assigned to identify the source of the weapon malfunctions that were plaguing law enforcement operations throughout Texas. Bradford's investigation focused on identifying common factors among the failed weapons, looking for manufacturers, suppliers, or maintenance providers who might be conducting sabotage activities. Klaus Mueller's name appeared repeatedly in Bradford's research, as his weapons were involved in a disproportionate number of failure incidents. But Klaus had anticipated the possibility of investigation and had prepared contingency plans for protecting his sabotage network if his activities were discovered. His workshop contained no evidence of the sabotage techniques he used, and his weapons appeared to be conventionally manufactured firearms that met all standard specifications for quality and reliability. Klaus's most important protection was the loyalty of his network, which included hundreds of people throughout East Texas who had benefited from his sabotage activities and who were committed to protecting his identity and methods. When Bradford began investigating Klaus's business, he encountered a wall of silence and misdirection that prevented him from gathering useful evidence. The breakthrough in Bradford's investigation came when he realized that Klaus's sabotage techniques were too sophisticated for a simple frontier gunsmith to have developed independently. The methods required advanced knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and mechanical engineering that suggested formal military or technical training that Klaus had never claimed to possess. Bradford's research into Klaus's background revealed discrepancies in his immigration records and military service history that suggested he was not the simple Bavarian craftsman he claimed to be. Further investigation uncovered Klaus's true identity as a former Prussian army officer who had been court-martialed for political activities, providing the motive and expertise needed for conducting sophisticated sabotage operations. Armed with evidence of Klaus's true background and his technical capabilities, Bradford planned a raid on the Gunsmith workshop that would hopefully reveal the sabotage techniques and equipment that Klaus was using to compromise weapons intended for law enforcement use. But Klaus's network had provided advance warning about Bradford's investigation, allowing the gunsmith to prepare for the raid by destroying evidence and implementing escape plans that had been developed for exactly this situation. When Bradford arrived at Klaus's workshop, he found only conventional gunsmithing equipment and no evidence of the sabotage activities that had been undermining law enforcement operations for over 20 years. Klaus himself had vanished without a trace, along with his most sensitive equipment and documentation. The Underground Railroad network that had supported his activities had successfully evacuated him to safety in Mexico, where he could continue his work under a different identity without fear of federal prosecution. Bradford's raid captured only a few of Klaus's associates, and these individuals provided no useful information about the sabotage techniques or the broader network that had supported Klaus's activities. The investigation concluded with the acknowledgement that Klaus had been conducting sophisticated sabotage operations, but without the evidence needed to understand or counter his methods. The impact of Klaus's sabotage activities extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages they provided to escaped slaves and Underground Railroad operatives. The systematic undermining of weapon reliability had fundamentally changed the dynamics of enforcement operations, making them far more dangerous and unpredictable for law enforcement personnel. Slave-catching organizations were forced to adopt new tactics that relied less on superior firepower and more on stealth, negotiation, and intelligence gathering. Many operations that would have previously been conducted through military-style assaults were abandoned because of concerns about weapon reliability and the increased risks involved. Federal authorities implemented new procedures for weapon procurement and maintenance that were designed to prevent sabotage, but these measures were largely ineffective because Klaus's techniques were too sophisticated and too well concealed to be detected through conventional inspections. The psychological impact of Klaus's sabotage activities contributed to growing public skepticism about the effectiveness and legitimacy of slave-catching operations. The image of armed manhunters being rendered helpless by weapon failures undermined the authority and intimidation value that had been crucial to the enforcement of slavery laws. Klaus's work also inspired technological innovations in weapon design and manufacturing that were intended to prevent sabotage, but these advances came too late to restore confidence in the reliability of firearms used for law enforcement purposes. The Underground Railroad networks that had benefited from Klaus's sabotage activities continued to use the techniques he had developed, training new saboteurs and establishing workshops in other territories where weapon sabotage could be conducted safely. Klaus Mueller's legacy lived on in every weapon that failed to fire when it was pointed at someone seeking freedom, and in every escape operation that succeeded because manhunters couldn't trust their firearms. His sabotage network had demonstrated that superior technology could be neutralized through superior intelligence and moral commitment. The gunsmith who made guns that never fired had actually created the most effective weapons in the fight against slavery. weapons that protected the innocent by refusing to harm them, and that ended a war not through violence, but through the principled application of mechanical precision to moral purpose. Years later, when slavery was abolished and the Underground Railroad was no longer needed, former operatives would tell stories about the mysterious German gunsmith whose weapons never worked when they were pointed at people who deserved to be free. Klaus Müller had proven that sometimes the most powerful act of creation is the refusal to participate in destruction, and that the finest craftsmanship serves humanity best when it refuses to serve inhumane purposes. The guns that never fired had spoken louder than any weapons that worked, declaring through their silence that some targets were too precious to be aimed at, and that some fights were too important to be won through violence. Klaus's legacy was written not in the history of successful shots, but in the catalog of crucial misfires that had allowed hope to triumph over hatred and freedom to prevail over oppression.